I was so disappointed in our chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff that was defending critical race theory in the teaching. Because if he really did read Karl Marx, which I frankly don't believe, if he read Mayo, he'd understand these things. That these are not some kind of brain surgeon stuff. He used to use a term called Gnosticism, or some kind of secret knowledge. There really isn't. The idea is just to break things down. Break them down, criticize, criticize, criticize.
Wait for Today is a program where we explore all things Second Amendment, all things that protect, threaten, and violate the Second Amendment rights of all Americans. My name's Zoe Warren, and I'm the host of 2A for Today. Today, we have an interview with Colonel Bill Connor. Colonel Connor is a Christian, a devoted family man, and he's been married to his lovely wife, Susan, for over 30 years. And they have 3 children. He and his family live in Orangeburg, South Carolina, where he is the owner and lawyer of Bill Connor Law Firm, LLC. Colonel Connor was also the former chairman of the Republican Party for the 6th Congressional District. The colonel joined the Army in 1990 and served over a decade as a regular Army infantry officer in the U.S. Army. After leaving active duty to become a reservist, he earned his Juris Doctorate from the University of South Carolina. In 2007, Colonel Connor volunteered for a year-long combat deployment in Afghanistan, serving as a joint operations officer, developing and implementing the U.S. advisory effort for Afghan national security forces. He later commanded the U.S. advisory effort in the volatile Helmand province and subsequently earned a promotion to lieutenant colonel. He also served as the senior American military liaison to British forces in Helmand, Afghanistan, where he served with Prince Harry. For his efforts in Afghanistan, he was awarded the Bronze Star and was put in charge of command and general staff officer instruction in South Carolina for the reserves. He was also promoted in 2015 to the South Carolina Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officer under U.S. Army North. He's a distinguished graduate from the U.S. Army War College, class of 2018 with an MSS degree, and a graduate of the Citadel, the military college of South Carolina. He was appointed to the South Carolina Floodwater Commission by Governor Henry McMaster and elected chairman of the National Security Task Force in January 2019. Governor McMaster also presented Colonel Connor the Order of the Palmetto, South Carolina's highest award, on July 8, 2021. Welcome to the show today, sir. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining the program today. You have a great deal of experience in the military, traveling all over the world, seeing different cultures. And I have been able to experience your presentation on Marxism and socialism, the things you've discerned. You have a long history of writing. You're a journalist, an investigative reporter as well, with the Times and Democrat down in Orangeburg. Kind of give me a little bit of background on your journalism and your, this kind of looking in and digging deep into Marxism, this path that you've gotten on here in the last year or so.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on your show. It really means a lot. And I left the regular Army back in 2002. And not too long after, we moved to Orangeburg, South Carolina, which is sort of deep in the heart of the Democratic part of the state. And so our local paper of record in this area is the Times and Democrat. Imagine that. And reading the articles, I just kind of chafed under it. So really starting almost within a year of getting there, almost 20 years ago. But as far as the issue of Marxism, I've written various things that led toward the issue of Marxism and how far it gotten, but really it's the last year or two. In fact, a man that really got beyond this was Pastor Vadi Bakum, and hopefully people can remember him. I mean, incredible preacher. I don't know if you know him, but he's got his PhD from Oxford and is in Zambia now as a missionary and also runs a university there. I mentioned that because when I started listening to Vadi Bakum, just an incredible story. Of course, background story, grew up in LA, African-American son of a single mother, Buddhist at the time. And apparently they had an uncle who'd been a drill instructor at Paris Island, got his life going. I mention all that because he really dug into critical race theory. And I started listening to him. And then I started really digging in a year or two ago. And that's where I started taking the knowledge I had in history of various different ideas, ideology, and writing everything I could. And you've already talked about Times and Democrat. I started writing for the Christian Post, the Charleston Mercury, and other papers, and including during the summer where it wasn't that popular at the time. I think a lot of folks are very surprised about just what's seen in the explosion of protests, which turned into riots, and what's going on. And listening to Buddy Bach and studying the issue, always loving history. I was a history major in school. You know, it's a lot of what I did in the War College. Love reading history. Started tying everything together ideologically and then just historically of what built into what we're seeing today.
Yeah, that's really, really good. It's interesting to me too, because a lot of people have different speculations, and the speculation is that, you know, there's a trend among collectivist societies in any place where tyranny really is, and that is that they disarm the population. And what they're doing is they're going back and trying to rewrite, I guess, history as far as the Second Amendment is concerned and the founders are concerned. Can you speak to any of that? I've been hearing a lot of that kind of stuff. And
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you know, the other thing is being a lawyer, I spent a lot of my time digging into the Constitution. What's interesting is in law school, the required Constitution course really leaves out a lot. All lawyers get the same course. They start with Marbury versus Madison, and they learn about case law leading up to where we are now without ever digging into the Federalist Papers. You know, where did the ideas come from the Constitution? What did things mean? That's not part of what lawyers and judges get. So I'll tell you that right now. It's something very important because it delves right into the issue you talked about and sort of the two worldviews I mentioned when I spoke to your group. You know, going back to just before the French Revolution, you had a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau and some of his ideas about man being a blank slate. And this whole idea of men in a materialist sense, of which eventually with Charles Darwin, the idea is we really are just material. We're solely affected by our society. You have one view, and therefore, if you can have elites that collectively form society, they can form men into that image. That is a view that went back even before Marx. For our founders, they're revolutionaries, but they're revolutionaries toward the traditional Christian view, Judeo-Christian view of the sin nature of man, that we're all born to sin. We come toward Christ. We accept his forgiveness, but even that forgiveness, we still have to keep repenting of sin, and we have a sin nature. And therefore, throughout history, what it's shown us is that sin nature can't handle power. You know, Lord Acton, who was British at the time, made a great saying, which is power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the founders understood that because of their Christian worldview, their Christian understanding of man, but also the idea that man has a spark that's different from all other species, animals, that we are made in the image of God. And it's so important because that was what the Declaration told the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That didn't mean we're all the same physically as far as short, tall. What it meant is that we are made in the image of God equally. We have the same equal legal worth. And I will tell you that throughout history, Woodrow Wilson, you go back even farther than that, progressives don't believe that. They believe that rights and everything else, because of course it goes on from being created equal, we are endowed by our Creator. We told the world we believe in God collectively, and that we are endowed directly from God with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Now, I'm going to stop with that very quickly too, because that was almost a direct lift from John Locke, who was a British political theorist that Jefferson was using. And he used the three as being life, liberty, and property. When they used pursuit of happiness, that really was still putting property, but it's the idea that if you have liberty and property, you can pursue your own happiness. You can start your own business. You can live the life you want to live. Yeah. Pursuit of happiness was tied directly into property. So I want to mention that bit. But it's interesting at that time, this ties in the Second Amendment, is that, you know, first we fought the revolution. We're in the Articles of Confederation. Basically, each one of the colonies and states was really a separate nation. And then we run into all the problems after the revolution of different money, different treaties with other sides, really no way to keep things together. So we had the Constitutional Convention. After the Constitutional Convention, you had arguments about why the other side, those who opposed the Constitution, should accept a federal government which had with the Supremacy Clause. And it ties right into the Second Amendment, because This all ties into our worldview. Man is a sin nature, really can't be trusted with power. The Constitution breaks power among the federal government. So you got the three branches, and even within the first branch, you got the House and Senate, all these checks. And then the second check, which is the dual sovereignty. The states have general police powers and sovereignty. The federal government has enumerated power sovereignty. And it was really a first of its kind, that kind of federated system. But the idea was, again, to keep, they'd seen what the abuses in Europe, they left the tyranny of all these, the monarchs, where they had state churches, which controlled everything. We didn't want that, but they also had monarchs that trampled on their rights. So when they were trying to sell the idea of a federal government to the states, this is a quote from James Madison, where the issue came up of, wait a second, if the federal government under the supremacy clause gets to decide the disputes and issues, that puts them in such a superior power that they could abuse that power. Mm-hmm. They could trample our rights in the states. And Madison and Hamilton, who were trying to defend the Constitution, said this about why they wouldn't have to worry about it. And this goes into, again, the idea of man, the separation of powers, the fact that we believe all men are created equal, we all have equal rights, but that also that man has a sin nature. So what James Madison wrote, and this is in Federalist 46, is let a regular army fully equal to the resources of the country be entirely at the devotion of the federal government. Still, it would not be going too far to say the state governments with the people on their side would be able to repel the danger. To a federal army would be opposed by a militia amounting to nearly 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands. Okay, this is something you don't hear much about, but when the discussion is made, because this ties right into the Second Amendment, this goes right into all the discussions about why they added the militia clause, which militia, of course, meant every able-bodied man not only had a right but a duty to defend himself, his family. This cuts out the issue of hunting. It's, yes, we hunt, but at the same time, though, this is all about man's sin nature, man's equal worth, what we believe, as opposed to, I'm going to talk about the collectivists in a little bit. It says, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possessed over peoples of all other nations at that time. So at that time, you already had, people think gun control was just something that started under Stalin or Hitler, and they did, and tyrants need that. But it was already in place, as he says, throughout nations of the world. In that case, they're talking about Western nations with kings controlling the people. But it says the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which militia officers are appointed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit. Notwithstanding the military establishments of several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms in those countries. And for the real reason of this, which is this is the ultimate check on power. Mm-hmm. It is not certain that with this aid alone, they would not be able to shake off their yokes. So the whole point there for Madison, it goes on, by the way, in various different discussions about this, is you don't have to worry about the Constitution giving too much power to the federal government because, first of all, the primary loyalties are to the states. But second of all, everyone's armed. And so that is the check. That is the ultimate check that allowed people to sign on to the Constitution. And I say that because around that same time frame, you had another development which led into Marxism. Because if you talk to communists, they will take their stuff back to the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. And the French Revolution sort of founded more on Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of sort of men being a blank slate and materialism being what their environment made them, as opposed to the spark of God, made the image of God. They're evolving. Mm-hmm. We can collectivize people. We can form them into new man. We can control the development of man. Those ideas came, and one of the first things they did was attack against religion, attack against Christianity. The French Revolution, for those that know, attacked the church, not just killing priests and ministers and all that, but trying to burn down bells and trying to go to a 10-day week, get rid of it didn't work very well, but they attempted it.
They turned the churches into centers of reason. I thought that was
exactly. Yes, exactly. In Notre Dame, they brought the Lady of Reason. I mean, they burned the church bells down to make other things. They saw the church. They saw the idea of God as being a hindrance to the humanism of their collective ideas. And their revolution failed beyond misery. So what you see, and you're seeing that now in some ways, is Robespierre and and the crazies, quite frankly, that we saw, we initially cheered it out a little bit, like Jefferson, but then even he backed off saying, whoa, this is not where we want to go. And they went to Napoleon, a tyrant, all the way up to finally restoring the monarchy. And then, France eventually moved on in much more Republican government. But the French Revolution was just a bloodbath that turned on itself. What was interesting, by the way, too, is all the initial crazies, the radicals, got their heads cut off, too, including Robespierre.
Yeah.
But Marx looked back on that, too, by the way, because those ideas percolated. And what Marx saw is the same idea of human nature, of there is no God, and religion's an opiate of the people. And he wrote horrendous things, by the way, about Christianity, about religion. But he believed that really man is evolving, and this helps, kind of lead toward where Darwinism took us. He's a materialist. He's an economic materialist. He believed that economic systems really formed who and what we were. And so what he believed was, quite frankly, within this, is that if you could take away religion, cause the people to collapse, that eventually you can form them into this new society, it's a utopia, but you've got to destroy everything first. So one of the first things of Marxism is agitation, division, division, division. It's all about collapsing systems. When they asked Marx one time what his primary purpose in life was, he said two things. The first thing was to dethrone God. You can go back to all the quotes in him. Dethrone God was the first thing he had to do. And the second thing was destroy capitalism. Yeah. They went together. But it wasn't just that, by the way. He saw things like the family, the father-led family, patriarchal family. The term patriarchy was used throughout the Communist Manifesto. You look at Das Kapital, all about get rid of the family, because they believed that helped lead toward these historic ideas coming to the people. Destroy history, because what he believed too is that if you can control the past, you control the future. Yeah. And so when you see things like the Russian Revolution that killed the whole Tsar's family, extended family, everybody, rename the cities, destroys monuments, things we're seeing now. But Marx taught this stuff in leading toward this communist utopia where they could first collectivize, and it would be worldwide, there wouldn't be governments or anything else, and then eventually everyone shares everything and there's no private property, so that was the sort of things he wrote about. But when you look at Marx, and this goes through all the main characters of the Marxism, communism, he was a despicable human being. I mean, he really, his family, he sponged off them. He almost never worked. When he did, it was sort of, he wrote, by the way, the New York Tribune, which became the New York Times, wrote all kinds of articles from the UK, from Europe, for what became the New York Times, our wonderful paper now. That was Karl Marx, but mainly he just sponged off people. Two of his children committed suicide, two of his daughters committed suicide. His son was actually of Cuban ancestry, so he used racial epithets toward him, treated him so bad, he committed suicide too. He had an affair with his maid, child out of wedlock with that, and tried to get Friedrich Engels, the guy who was given all the money, to take the blame for that. I go through story after story about, again, his family, how he treated them. So he wrote about the greed and the corruption of capitalism, but it was all about himself. He came from a rich family. He used up his trust fund early. He sponged off relatives. So he was the epitome of what you see within all the main characters in Marxism and communism of being hypocrites. But their ideas was that they could develop, again, an elite that could destroy what we have in society now, they believe is causing all the problems, set up a new society, and man would change. He would evolve into this new sort of dynamic. The only way to get there is destroy God, destroy Christianity, destroy the church, destroy families, take away fathers out of households, so you got children being raised by the state, and eventually, again, form this new man. So anyway, his ideas percolated until eventually you see the Russian Revolution in 1917. And there's a number of things I've glossed over with that. But one of the things about that revolution was Marx taught that it was scientifically inevitable that communism would overtake capitalism. That there was just, and as soon as one major country went, it would immediately take over the world. The world would become communist. After the Russian Revolution, it didn't go anywhere. It was stopped. And they had these groups throughout different European countries that were just shocked into, wait, Marx told us that as soon as people were class conscious, a major country comes, it's going to all go to communism. What's going on here? And that's where you started to some of the issues that we're going to come forward to today, is this idea of we need to do something different in countries that aren't automatically having the proletariat, the worker revolution. In Italy, you had a guy, a very important man even now, named Antonio Gramsci. And what he taught was, it eventually became part of the Frankfurt School thinking as well, all the way into Harvard and eventually to us, was in order to get a proletarian revolution in a place with firm structures, church, family, all that, you first got to break it down. And what he talked about was flipping the cultural hegemony. And so the idea is criticism. You criticize, you lampoon, you do all you can to hit the church, hit the family, hit patriarchy, destroy sexual morality, all the things you can do. And the idea is to implode society. And part of the idea is, again, develop the oppressor and the oppressed, which before had strictly been the bourgeois and the proletariat. This now became, wait a second, there are other oppressed and oppressors. We need to get all of them agitated, implode society, get all that going, because once it implodes, then you'll have the proletarian revolution or the communist revolution. Now, he was actually arrested, died in prison in 1937, but his writings, the prison notes, the prison writings, went to what they call the Frankfurt School in Germany. And this is very important as it leads to America. They were a group in the 1920s that wanted Germany to become communist. And they were shocked at their lack of progress. So the 20s, they were more standard Marxian proletariat bourgeoisie. But then at the end of the 20s, they got hold of Antonio Gramsci's writings, and they started moving toward what we would consider cultural Marxism. And then by the late 30s, they were even talking about critical theory. And that's where the term was first used in the 1930s. The Frankfurt School group of academic communists, basically, were forced out of Germany by the Nazis in the 1930s. So they came to primarily Columbia University, but really went to various Ivy Leagues. One of the members was a guy named Herbert Marcuse. And if you really study the left to this day, he's called the father of the New Left. And he wrote this book in the early 1965 called Repressive Tolerance, where what he argued is it's the Gramscian thinking about flipping the cultural hegemony is true tolerance is suppressing speech from the right, suppressing actions from the right, so pushing the right down because they're the oppressors.
Equity.
And it means pushing up the other side. And he'd written a book already called Eros about how sexual morality needs to end. But again, same idea of flipping the cultural hegemony, destroying patriarchy, the family, all these kind of things. In fact, for Black Lives Matter, if you look down their list of things they want, they kind of moved off now, but disrupting the nuclear family was definitely a thing that you'd look at within Herbert Marcuse. But his writings, and he continued writing, by the way, he is considered the father in many ways of American critical theory, which became critical legal theory in the 70s and the 80s. And then a guy at Harvard too named Derek Bell sort of developed the first ideas of critical race theory. And all it was the same, now we have 50 different critical theories. There's critical Latino theory, there's even critical witch theory. I mean, there's a crazy number of theories, but they're all about criticism. So the idea is you attack the church, you attack the family, you attack institutions, you collapse society, and then out of the smoldering dust of this, they believe that a proletarian revolution is going to come. Eventually, they go to the Marxian, theories. And Marcuse, did criticize Stalinism a bit, though, unfortunately not nearly enough, because what he considered the excesses. And so what started to come about in the 60s was this idea that, well, we got guys like Stalin and others, Mao Zedong, and they're pushing things, but they're not true Marxists. I mean, Marxism can work, and we need to find the American context of it. And part of that was looking at oppressor and oppressed differently. And that's where you get a lot of the sexual sort of oppressor-oppressed, or the gender oppressor-oppressed, the racial. So you get critical race theory. So all that comes together into the idea of the two worldviews. And our worldview on the right has been, we've been very naive to it. I was naive to what was going on. We just kind of thought, well, these are academics doing their academic thing in the ivory towers. It doesn't affect us. Well, I think after last year and seeing the riots and the explosion and what people are doing with it, really, quite frankly, hatred of not just America itself, or correction symbols, but as America itself. Because one of the things that the Frankfurt School taught, Marcuse taught, was there is systematic oppression, whether it be racism or other types of isms, and it's systematic.
Yeah.
And so within critical race theory, the idea is that it may look fair. It may be that such that the laws are all fair. There may be affirmative action, maybe whatever. But regardless, that doesn't matter. What matters is that subjective opinions of those who are the oppressed counter any kind of reason, logic, anything else of those who are considered the oppressor class. Intersectionality comes in, by the way, where you got, someone who could be female, black, lesbian, various different things come together at once into the idea of intersectionality of oppressed status.
A spectrum of oppression.
Exactly. Exactly. So, but it's all about the agitation, make things about race. But the real terrible thing about it is that it starts with the base that the system is corrupted. So no matter what we've done with the Civil Rights Act, with Martin Luther King Jr., his dream of his children not being judged by their color skin, by the content of their character, all that goes out the door. They believe saying the word colorblind is a racist idea because the Marcusian thing of true tolerance is crushing the right and pushing up the left. Yeah. So all these things kind of came together. I know for me, I've done a lot of writings. When I started law school 20 years ago, I had read about critical legal theory, but didn't have much time for it. And it basically kind of said that even though things look fair, that actually it's an oppressive system because you go back to such and such. And the other part is history now, because if you look at the founders, they absolutely did not revolt against the Great Britain to protect slavery. Quite the opposite. In fact, that's one of the issues was it's a continued slave trade. Really, when the first group of, you want to call it nations, if you will, to end slavery were the Northeast of the United States that already said in the Constitution, we said that by 1808, we would stop the slave trade. We said that. And it was actually, Great Britain eventually went to 1807. Mm-hmm. But, the slave trade, for example, is one of the things. In the northern states, they outlawed it before anybody else outlawed it.
Before they even gave themselves a Bill of Rights in Pennsylvania, they had banned slavery.
What you're seeing, too, within like the 1619 Project, which is just fraudulent history, it really is. I mean, it's one thing to teach the true history of slavery. It's an evil. It should never be done again. We got it. Now, it was unfortunately a human condition thing going back 3,000, since the beginning of slavery. So, it's there's a lot to teach about that. No problem with teaching that. So that's really not the issue. What critical race theory does is it really warps motivations. So, for example, you take the start founding of the United States, it was anything but to protect slavery, as we know. And in fact, the whole thing with the all men are created equal, I've seen criticisms from Democratic Congress people saying that only meant white slaveholding, whatever. And that was not what it meant. And John Locke was clear. It was the species, which actually would have even meant women at the time. But the idea is all are created equal. We're all endowed by God. And so the founders knew that was going to eventually end slavery.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, that you were saying earlier about agitation, division, and their whole aim is to get the populace to revolt, especially now, against, I guess, white people, the white supremacy, anything that has to do with the founders. And what they're doing now is it's even the Biden administration. Even before the Biden administration, we're talking about even George Bush establishing certain domestic terrorist Patriot Act kind of language that would create a class that will be prosecuted, especially in America, called like domestic terrorists. And then they would have this, list of characteristics that a domestic terrorist would have to have in order to qualify. And what's funny is that Democrats in 2020 justified every single line of the domestic terrorist statute that was being done by Antifa and Black Lives Matter. They justified it over and over. I have a video where over and over they're like, it's not going to stop. They need to keep protesting. They need to keep putting pressure on the government. Everything that's in the line for domestic terrorism, they justified it. But they're trying to just only put white right wing because they want to get rid of the right. You were saying, Marcuse was saying, we have to get rid of the right? And that's how you do anti-racism. That's how you do equity. That's how you do justice. It's not equality. It's actually putting this other group down so you can raise this other group up. They're actually using that right now. We got these guys you would consider, they call them insurrectionists, the protesters in January 6th. Essentially their habeas corpus has been suspended for them.
Oh, yeah.
So and using these tools. And so can you speak? I don't want to go too far off the Second Amendment, but truly, this is the only way they're going to be able to, it seems to me, overthrow the right is by being able to call them domestic terrorists and have them have been disarmed. And so they're pushing pushing people that are on the right that because I even just saw something in an article that said that they're not able to fully stop white supremacy or domestic terrorism unless they take away guns. Guns is the thing that's preventing them from stopping domestic terrorism. Right. So can you speak to any of that, or did I go too much? Okay, great.
Yeah, no, I'd like to. Now I want to tie back to something I didn't talk about because it ties into the subject, is the Cultural Revolution in China. And you'll understand why I'm going to do this in a second. What you're seeing a lot of from the left right now is that you guys believe in the First Amendment, and your First Amendment is not being harmed by those in the government. You know, if you believe in sort of freedoms, then news agencies and all that have their freedoms to do things. And because we're seeing a lot of the attacks on, by the way, is through corporations, through big tech, through the media, which technically would be conceived of as being sort of private entities. Though, of course, we know there's a lot of coordination with the Democrats. Yeah. The Cultural Revolution is interesting. It started in 1966. China had just gone through what they call the Great Leap Forward. Millions and millions of Chinese died, so it was very unpopular for Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. And allegedly, the students in Peking and students throughout the country became patriot guards, and that was the impetus with this whole thing of destroying the past, humiliating anyone who wasn't thinking correctly. And the way it was helped by Mao is he gave orders to the police: stand down, don't do a thing, let them go. They killed millions and millions of people. They destroyed all this history in China. If you didn't raise your fist and sort of say the right things, and there was this thing called the Little Red Book, that you better have a Little Red Book on you, because it wasn't enough just to be neutral. You had to be kind of, anti the four roles. Sort of like we see a lot of times with Black Lives Matter with you need to raise your fist. So anyway, they used all that in a private context that was condoned by the government, and it destroyed a lot of the rights. And it also ties into the gun ownership thing, is that at that time, he had already gone through, the people in China were disarmed. So it completely allowed this to run amok. And you had the Patriot Guard. It finally ended, in the early 70s. But by then, it really, again, killed millions and millions of people and destroyed lives and all that. A lot of similarities to what we're seeing now with the coordination of the big media, the big tech. We saw it during the campaign, for example, and shutting down Hunter Biden's laptop story, which is a true story, as we all know, but it helped win an election and all that. Well, it ties in the gun ownership thing, too, because it is one that you're seeing just this coordination within the media, the constant hammering of, like right now, we're seeing the incredible violence in New York and Chicago, wherever, is the blaming. And the blaming, of course, in this case is not about all the fact they defund the police and all the craziness they put in motion, but it's about the guns. And so that is the argument. And again, it comes back into this idea that on our side, we believe in sinful and checks on power, but we also need all men are created equal as far as legal equality amongst each other. There is no elite. So who's one man to tell another, you can't have a gun or you can't have so many guns, so on and so forth. Yeah. They're trying to break all that down. And so the idea, and it really ties in as well to COVID, where, instead of allowing people decision-making and all this, there's come more of a collective attitude. We're just going to force things from the top on down through elites and everything else. And I'm one, by the way, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I just believe that we should all be able to make the decision based on what we study, what we know, we understand, because, finding truth is a process. But it definitely is, as we showed, going all the way back to the founding of the country, the arms are really the only thing keeping us at this point from completely going under. If we didn't have arms, didn't have at least that threat, it's kind of like when you're saying in the military. I spent 30 years, and I was in combat different times, but the majority of my 30 years was not in combat. But I was still doing my duty because I was a deterrent. I recall deploying off to Kuwait when Saddam sent 7 divisions to the border in '94, and he chickened out. He turned around and went back, and he would have gone if we hadn't flown in and shown that force and shown the ability to do what we're going to do. That's all deterrence. A major deterrence right now is that we are armed, and we need to stay armed, quite frankly. It's interesting. You read some of the post-Cold War accounts of Soviet officers and even the Japanese during World War II talking about the idea of invading America, and it was a nightmare. Just the plan on it was like, there's no way, because You got literally, I think, there's the Japanese admiral, you're going to find someone behind every blade of grass. You got a gun, you got a person there who defend themselves. And so these are all things that tie into the individual rights, this whole idea that our rights come from God, we're made in the image of God, we're all equal, and no one can take our rights, versus the collective attitude that if we can just get some elites in, then we can help form the society which will change people, will evolve into a new communist man, a utopia that we're all love and everything else. And when it comes to racism, by the way, ties in this bit too, is we believe racism is a sin. And when we read the great parable of the Good Samaritan, and that tells us that we are to be racist, not to matter at all. It's a great sin. At the same time, sin's going to be with us till Christ comes back. So we can do what we can to educate people, do what they can. We also understand that on all sides there will be sin and there will be racism. The other side believes that we can eradicate it, that we can, again, form the perfect man and perfect utopia. And so we see a lot of their actions too. And that, again, it all comes from taking the guns, taking away rights and everything else to lead us towards that utopia.
Yeah, because in any society, you're going to have multiple pools, communities, cultures. And if you're going to force people who don't want to have a collectivist society to do it, you're going to have to beat some of them over the head. And you're not going to be able to beat somebody over the head if they're carrying, even, a musket. At least they're going to get one shot off.
Yeah. I want to give you an example of how the corrosiveness of what we're seeing. When I was commissioned, it was 1990, and I spent 4 years as a cadet. The highest ranking officer in the military was Colin Powell. It was not a big deal. I'd grown up in the military. I was a military brat. And honestly, race was literally almost a non-existent, even a thought process. In fact, for us, we were wondering, why is the media making a deal about this? Because it's just not a deal. Well, literally, that was the thought process. There may have been some kind of supremacist work. But really, I never saw it. It would have been taken care of. And that was 31 years ago.
Yeah.
And then you come to where we are now with what you're teaching people. And if you tell them that it's all out there, that the military has got all these issues and whatever, what's it going to do? It's kind of like telling you with your spouse that, she's probably cheating on you, whatever it may be. But you're adding things in that are absolutely. So now we've got a situation where, we're growing just deep distrust, deep divisions that we had moved past, we had come past. And it's interesting too, by the way, I saw this chart and it talked about America's views of race relations. And this is going back to 2007. It was somewhere around 70% of Americans were positive about race relations. Within, as I recall correctly, I go by memory here, it was like 6-7 years later, it was down to 40%. So it's like you're moving forward, our society's moving forward, we're coming together, but then what's happened since that time with Ferguson and all these various different things, these various groups that are sort of been influenced by Marcuse, the Gramscian thinking. By the way, the guy who translated Gramsci in Commentaries for America was Pete Buttigieg's father in the 1970s. Little tidbit.
Yeah.
They call them red diaper babies, but he's one of them. So you've got that infiltration that came in our schools that, things may look good, and Colin Powell may be the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff and all this, but actually, the system is all rigged against you. You can't succeed unless you destroy the system.
The whole system is white supremacy. It was designed in order to give advantage to the children of the white supremacists. And so therefore things like competition and meritocracy, math, those things are all white supremacy. It's really ridiculous. But I think though, truly, if we can get to the place where we can really bring the Second Amendment back up to, I think, the honor that it's due. And I don't think the Second Amendment gives us any rights. I believe God gave us our rights, and the Second Amendment just recognizes those rights and protects it. And I think the one part of that Second Amendment that's not really, I don't think, communicated that well is it was not necessarily about my right to be like Charles Bronson or Clint Eastwood and carry my .357 Magnum and dare people to make my day. It was actually my duty by God. The Bible says the second greatest command is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So that would mean I'm duty bound by God if I see my neighbor in trouble to help them, if I would help myself. If I would defend myself, then I need to defend them. that's what the militia was about. It was about the community being secure. It was about us making sure that marauders and thieves, whatever, don't come in and just take advantage of our women and children and our neighbors in general. And so I've been essentially preaching the Second Amendment this way, that our founders wanted to protect our ability to do the second great commandment, because it's a violation of my conscience to have to watch my neighbor be beat over the head by communists, like, Kyle Rittenhouse, to have things destroyed that belong to other, and not be able to protect them, because if it was happening to me, I would protect myself. So I'm duty bound by God to obey the second greatest command and to love my neighbor as I would myself.
Right.
It's like that mindset's been lost from our culture now. If we can do you want to speak to that at all, or what are your thoughts?
No, I first of all, just agree with you completely. And I do, again, I go back to the real thing in this is spiritual when it comes down to it, that Marx said that he wants to dethrone God. In the end, that's the first thing he said before capitalism is, this is all about the hatred of God. God says, do not love the world or things in the world. Doesn't mean it's creation, it means the world system. So the world system is going to be against us. And we see that in a lot of things that are going on, but you're exactly right. That part of the idea, the reason I joined the military wasn't to go out and kill people. It was to defend who we are, the nation I love. And that's exactly what, for me, Christ said, great love, no man in this, that he gives his life for his friends. I mean, to us, that's why we're serving. That's why, folks gave their lives. It was not about, killing hatred. It's interesting watching the left too, because you got the group MFAC, who, I'm all for their rights to bear arms, but because it's a minority group that's, very passionately there's all kinds of praise on that sort of thing. Of course, someone needs to teach them about accidental discharges, because that's been a major issue on it. But we're not against, like, their rights are fine, but don't be hypocritical and say, okay, that's great, but other people holding weapons and doing it responsibly. That's the piece that this does tie directly into Christianity. I also believe, by the way, too, that the Bible is very clear about my duty as a man is protector and provider. I'm very disturbed about this idea of the draft for women, because that's a whole separate thing. It's moved us into a new sort of anti-biblical idea that we don't need it, and we are to protect women and children.
And it's wholly unnecessary. I mean, okay, I am not anti-military by any stretch of the imagination. I am concerned about anti-constitutional acts that are being done. Like, I believe sometimes that we will allow politicians to violate the Constitution out of necessity for the hour, right? And so I think we're at that point now where, like, the United States, the Constitution gives Congress the right to raise money and in order to raise an army, right? Not necessarily maintain. It does say maintain a navy, and I'm not against it.
Every 2 years, that was a check on power too. You're exactly right. Every 2 years, so Congress could end the standing regular army within 2 years.
And so the issue still remains that we are supposed to be the militia. We're the defensive front on the home front. There was no, the National Guard doesn't even apply, because the National Guard goes overseas. I mean, the militia was purely defensive, And so I'm not even thinking about in terms of, like the Green Mountain Boys, or just some random, militia group that's out there in the woods right now doing FTXs, as much as just we as the male populace between X age and X age. I think the Supreme Court has ruled on 7 occasions that police officers have no obligation to protect anyone at all, unless they're in their custody. So who's obligated to protect us then? It's us.
I know. Well, so I would tell you this, that if you can, I think the whole Federalist number 26, quite frankly, is one that whole quote destroys them, because they'll hear sometimes people on the right talk about the right to bear arms being a check on government. Remember what Biden said about it? He's like, come on, you would need nuclear bombs and F-16. Here it is. Mr. Biden, wait a second. Here's what James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said about this. he said it. I can just quote him directly, and they're going to say you're extremist. But I just quoted directly. Someone will grab this clip and say, I'm just quoting James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who were trying to argue for a stronger federal government. And they were saying, look, the reason why we got to check on, the reason you don't have to worry of states is because you got the weapons, you got the guns. If we attempted this, you'd have 500,000 people to go against a 50,000 man standing army, you'd win. That's what they're saying in the whole thing. And really, we understood that up until very recently.
Yeah. I have friends that would whisper to I would call him resident Joe Biden, even though he's our president. I have to honor that. They would whisper to him, your terms are acceptable, sir. Truly, because they don't want any restrictions whatsoever. Why should I not be able to park an F-16 in my backyard? I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, then too, I mean, as we know from, if you know about warfare, is that we start talking about those weapons. I mean, go ahead and use a nuclear weapon, and even F-16. It's like, the wars are won by infantrymen on the ground, so it's a tactical end, and the way we are now with the country, all the urban areas blue and the rural areas, it's just a retarded, ridiculous statement to make.
Yeah, but he's the king of ridiculous statements to make. We went from the Twitter machine to the gaff machine. I enjoy looking for quotes for Joe Biden weekly for my program.
Oh yeah. Well, the latest about his butt being wet was, I think, the funniest I've seen in quite a long time.
What? I didn't hear that. Hilarious. Well, thank you so much for being on the program with us today, and it's a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. It's an honor. I'm so excited about where we're headed, because it seems like, I hate the term woke, so I would say awake. There is an awakening, to the spirit of truth that's happening, and I don't believe that we can save the country by changing out some law or politician. I personally believe that we have to, if we have to change out politicians, we have to change laws, but we have to have an informed electorate. Otherwise, we're going to be right back where we are today in 10 or 15 years. So thank you so much for joining in the fight to inform the populace and help other people to enter into the truth that you have been given from God. So thank you so much, brother.
Thank you, Zoe.
That concludes our program for today. But again, in the coming weeks and months, Two Way for Today will be talking to experts, scholars, trainers, and all forms of gun right activists and Second Amendment proponents to answer the many questions that we all have and unpack the various laws and trespasses of our rights that have already been enacted and those that are on the horizon. Again, if the Second Amendment's important to you, make sure to subscribe to the New American Magazine and get on the top daily headline mailing list so that you get an email alert anytime we upload a video or stream a live event. And share these videos with your family and friends who feel the same, or those that are riding the fence between liberty and tyranny who need a little more convincing. You've been watching Two Way for Today. My name is Zoe. Post your comments or questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can, as fast as we can in the coming weeks and months. Thank you for watching Two Way for Today.